because I said what was on my mind. I made a lot of enemies. I made a lot
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of In Defense of Climate Change. My name is Bryce Nichols. I'm a professor of genetics at Rutgers University, and I'm joined once again by Roger Pelkey Jr., senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, professor emeritus at the University of Colorado Boulder, and author of the popular science policy substack, The Honest Broker. Roger, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. I'm in Washington, D.C. to teach a class, and it's going to be 100 degrees today, so a good context for having this discussion.
I'm in Jersey, and it's also approaching 100 degrees, I think, today and over the 4th of July weekend. And so we're going to talk about the heat in Europe, as it is the subject of a recent essay of yours called Europe's Deadly Aversion to Air Conditioning. Tens of thousands die in European summers for want of a technology the rest of the rich world takes for granted. Why don't you tell us, Roger, what prompted you to write this essay on air conditioning in Europe?
So I've written a fair bit about heat and its impacts in the context of adaptation and development. And interestingly, humans live everywhere from Antarctica to the Saharan desert, and so we're in a very adaptable species. Some of the broader context is that the World Health Organization did a report, I don't know, within the last 10 years on policies responding to extreme heat. And they had a very interesting conclusion. They said that with proper adaptation, the expected number of deaths from extreme heat is zero. And so it raises the question, after reading a lot of commentary, excellent work being done talking about the heat impacts in Europe, why it is that air conditioning has such low penetration rates across the continent. It's obviously northern latitude, but it does have heat waves, and let's just postulate, and it is true, as the IPCC has said, extreme heat waves are increasing, and they're increasing particularly in Europe. And so I was interested in better understanding the number one, the lack of air conditioning across Europe, and number two, the consequences of that, which is an explicit policy choice. So that was the motivation for doing the analysis, which is really a pretty simple sort of what if exercise.
So before I have you go through the analysis that you did, could you define a couple terms that are relevant to the discussion today? The two terms that'll come up are adaptation and mitigation. And can you explain what these terms mean in the context of climate policy discussion?
Yeah, they're really important. So mitigation refers to, in the jargon of the climate community, efforts to reduce greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, to levels. People have different views as to how far we should go, but the general understanding is that if you get to net zero, so there's on balance no net emission of greenhouse gases by humans, the global temperature rise will stop increasing in pretty short order after that. So mitigation is all about energy policy, carbon dioxide emissions. Adaptation is a completely different bucket. Adaptation, and it is contested, and there are different definitions, but the definition of the IPCC are efforts by humans to take actions to mitigate risks associated with weather and climate, and to exploit opportunities associated with weather and climate. And so if you go to Phoenix and you realize it's 110 degrees outside, you walk into a mall or a restaurant and it's air conditioned, that's an adaptation. If you go to the Midwest to a cornfield and you see a farmer putting on fertilizer, that's an adaptation. And so all of the things we do, and adaptation is a much bigger set of issues than just climate change. Adaptation is adapting to climate as it exists and as it varies and as it changes. And so all of the things we as a human species do to improve our our lot with respect to weather and climate. Both of us are inside buildings. I can see your roof. You can see my ceiling here. Those are adaptations. And so adaptation is an enormously broad set of actions that we take. One thing I'll say, in some of the discussion of climate policy, some people try to put adaptation as opposed to mitigation. And I push back pretty hard on that because they're just different sorts of policies for different sorts of outcomes. If you want to protect yourself against heat waves, um, you and I this week, go inside to air conditioning. There are really good reasons to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, but to modulate heat waves on human timescales is not very high on that list.
Yeah, this is a key theme of this essay, and I think a lot of your work in this area of climate policy. How policy decisions weigh adaptation versus mitigation. And like you said, it seems like a lot of people want to put these two things against one another. So we'll come back to that in a second. I did want to have you sort of go through sort of the nuts and bolts of this essay in terms of the numbers that you arrive at. So as you said, you ask a straightforward question, which is that if Europe had air conditioning penetration similar to the US or Japan, what would happen to heat mortality? Can you walk us through the calculation that you made and how you arrived at your various conclusions about the lives that would be saved?
Yeah, and so this is very much a sensitivity analysis, a what if exercise. It's not a forecast or a prediction. Obviously, the contexts of the U.S., Japan, and Europe are very different. Um, but there's a very good time series paper by Barreca et al. That I cite that basically looks at what were the consequences of the build out of air conditioning in the United States over many decades. And in a round number, they found that there was a 75% reduction in mortality after you adjust for other factors.
Since this is a science podcast, can you go through
Yeah,
why that's a 2016 paper, right?
yeah.
And can you walk us through why you think that paper is a very, is the one that you use for your calculation?
Yeah, so it's just an empirical paper. It's observational. It's not a modeling paper. It's not based on assumptions. And what they did is they looked at state level data on mortality adjusted for things like age and population growth, and they compared context to context. So Arizona to Arizona in 1990 versus Arizona in 2010, New Jersey in 1970 versus 2000. And so they did a very good job, in my opinion, of trying to isolate the signal of air conditioning in mortality data by adjusting for other known factors. And they did so over a very long period of time, which allowed them to capture the dramatic increase in the penetration of air conditioning in the United States. And so, as an empirical paper, there are different numbers in different places. Alaska is going to be different than Arizona, for example. But as the result they get, the effect is enormous. Insofar as when we look at the effects of policy and technology, they arrive at a number 75% reduction in mortality associated with the expansion of air conditioning. So that's the starting point I use, and I vary it, just arbitrarily 65% or 85%. And if someone said, "Well, I want to do 50% or 40%," that's fine. These are huge effects, and so what I did is, and let me say, in the U.S., um, air conditioning penetration is something. I think the number I have in the post is 76% these days. In Japan, it's more like 90%. And in Europe, it's closer to 20% overall. And it's very low in some places like France, I think is 3%. And this is of households. And in the UK, it's 5%. And so I simply ask the question: if we take that number, the 75% reduction in mortality, and we vary it a bit, and then we assume air conditioner penetration in Europe, similar to the United States and Japan, and we just do that simple math, what would we expect the outcome to be in terms of a reduction of mortality for a summer like 2022? which was a very extreme summer, and there is good data on the excess deaths that occurred that summer due to the heat waves that came through Europe. And the numbers, and again, these I wouldn't take these as, decimal point precise, but they're in the tens of thousands. So for penetration similar to the US, you get in a round number something like 25,000 uh, excess deaths avoided. And if it's a Japanese-like penetration, it's more like 35,000. And again, I wouldn't focus on the specific numbers, but the point here is that these numbers um, are to take the heat wave from the last couple of weeks that occurred in Europe. I've seen published reports that there were something like 1,300 excess deaths. And so these numbers are at least an order of magnitude larger than those numbers. And so my conclusion is that the results are not particularly sensitive to the sorts of assumptions you bring. And common sense. If there's a lot more air conditioning, and we can go into like, who are the people that actually die from extreme heat. If there's a lot more air conditioning, you are going to have lower mortality. And so I just wanted to get some sense of scale by doing the numbers.
It's not just an effect on people living or dying in terms of the question about air conditioning penetration. There's also an issue with school, right? And worker productivity and school, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't remember which one of the big consultancies recently, in the last 2 months, put out a report on GDP effects of extreme heat. I haven't verified the numbers or gone through the methodology, but their claim was that extreme heat over a summer reduces annual GDP in Europe by a few percentage points. So 3 to 5% hit on overall GDP, which it's not a huge number, but it's a consequential number. And so, yes, there are much broader effects. And you raise schools, if schools aren't air conditioned. Some of the biggest effects are actually on hospitals and places where old people are, because old people are the ones that are most susceptible to the effects of extreme heat.
I was going to link this to the Great Barrington Declaration to say that there could be one about air conditioning to say you could do a focused protection of elderly populations.
Yeah, so in the piece, I linked to a couple papers that look at the characteristics of individuals most susceptible to extreme heat and those who dominate the mortality numbers. And I think one paper has over 65s as being most susceptible, and another paper I said as the over 80s are the ones who most often are the ones who die prematurely. And since old people are typically concentrated in fewer places than the whole population, simply building out air conditioning in the places where you find the older set would have disproportionate benefits on reducing heat mortality.
You mentioned this thing about common sense a moment ago, and maybe we could pivot a little bit to the morality of when policies are designed for the purpose of mitigation of the effects of climate change, and those policies lead to an increase in deaths. Because it does seem like it's very, this air conditioning does seem to be very clearly a case, or you're in Europe, the lack of air conditioning is driven by policies, decisions that are made by governments to prioritize mitigation of the effects of climate change, which then result in less, or fewer air conditioning or less penetration of air conditioning, which then results in death. And that to me is why that's why I wanted to talk to you about this, because this is one of those cases where it's kind of like I look at this and say, what are we doing? What is important to us? To me, it seems clear that you would not prioritize climate change over human life. That seems clear to me. I understand we would want to do something with that, with mitigating, the effects of climate change. But when you have a clear-cut situation of causing tremendous harm, which is what is happening at scale year after year after year, with policies that make more people die because they don't
Yeah.
have air conditioning, this just seems insane to me. Can you just address this topic sort of head on? The
Yeah.
idea that you have this like moral or political value of trying to ward off the effects of climate versus saving human lives?
Yeah. So the bigger picture here is a story that is often occurring. In the United States, we have a version of this with the battle over data centers and AI and technologies. Um, Technologies have politics, and people put morality and politics onto technologies. So nuclear power is another example. In the United States, we saw battles over light bulbs 15 years ago, SUVs, fracking. Uh, so there is this idea out there that technologies are they're scary, they're bad, they're wrong. They reflect, in this case, they reflect using more energy, and for a certain group of folks out there, which is more prevalent in Europe, the idea that degrowth is an answer to our problems, meaning that we should shrink the sizes of our economy, and if we're going to deploy much more air conditioning, that will apply some incremental increase in energy consumption. It's a lot smaller than people might think, particularly in Europe. But there is this battle, and I can tell you, I just heard 2 days ago, it was on the BBC World Service. Don't remember her name, but a European Commission official was saying, why would we build out more air conditioners? Because that will just contribute to the problem of climate change rather than solving climate change and not having to deal with heat waves. And, for me, that presents adaptation versus mitigation as some sort of a trade-off. And to get right to the point, France, which has very low penetration of air conditioners, its electricity grid is almost carbon free. It's nuclear power. You could expand the electricity grid and production in France, as they have in the past, have zero increase in carbon dioxide emissions, and that would allow for much broader penetration of air conditioning. And so, to me, it reveals that this debate is really not about emissions or climate change. It's a much more deeply seated cultural debate about the role of technology in our societies. And the aversion to air conditioning in Europe goes back a long time. A country like Greece, which is very hot, it has a much higher penetration than most of Europe, but it's still only the data that I reported was 43%. So it's a little bit like you're wearing glasses, and glasses are a technology. And no one thinks that glasses are immoral, that you should see with your natural eyes. We don't have those. It seems silly to say that. But air conditioning, if you go to Phoenix or Washington, D.C. or New Jersey, people are pretty happy and thankful for that modern technological invention that you can get out of the 100-degree heat. Um, and it hasn't become moral. But some technologies in some places do take on that moral character. Pasteurization of milk, fluoride in water, vaccines. The list of technologies that become politicized is very long, and I think it shares a lot of the same characteristics as the air conditioning discussion in Europe.
Well, do you think, I guess there's politicization of an issue and then there's the moralization. I guess there's in like placing morality or like saying you're a bad person if you do this. And some of them, I guess some of it is about technology, but is it about technology or is it about energy use?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think there is a sense that consuming energy is a bad thing. And this goes back to the early days of the environmental movement, where there was concern about the limits of resources. And so this has ties to the neo-Malthusian view of Paul Ehrlich and John Holdren and folks of the 1970s. And the concern was, we're going to run out of energy. It was just in the 1990s that there was a concerns about peak oil. And so this idea was baked into a lot of people's worldviews that we need to conserve energy or else we're going to run out. That's kind of the logical scientific framing, but that overlapped with the view that consuming energy is a bad thing. the idea of the carbon footprint, or if you're flying on a long haul airplane, or extended to Europe, if you have air conditioning, that's a sign of immorality or vice, or it's wrong because of what we're doing to the earth. Or the idea that going to Amory Lovin's in 1970s view that small is beautiful, living local and consuming less energy, you have a lighter footprint on the planet. And one of the ironies of that view, and we document there's a paper led by Matt Burgess that's kind of the larger picture of the post on air conditioning, is that it turns out that that countries that consume vastly more energy have decreasing environmental footprints, because we become much more efficient in our use of resources, and it takes a lot of energy to actually do that, which may be counterintuitive to some people. John Murdoch at the Financial Times had a great column on this just last week, on another paper by Matt Burgess and Ashley Dancer, one of his students, looking at the decoupling of economies from their impacts. And it turns out that it's the rich countries that are doing the best on that. So it can be counterintuitive, um, but that's what the data shows.
So that's a fascinating point you just, and is that in the preprint that you just put out in January? Is that in the
Yeah,
January
so the
preprint that,
preprint is called the economics of climate adaptation optimism. It's gotten broken into two papers since the preprint, and one's being reviewed at PNAS. But the basic idea there is that if you look at the positive outcomes associated with humanity, and obviously the impacts go well beyond just humans, but if you look at the positive impacts associated with humanity related to better adapting ourselves to climate variability and climate change, there's an incredibly good news story there. And I'll just, the data point that tells it the most is that the loss of life from extreme weather events around the world, if we go back to 150 years, it hasn't just gone down, it's gone down by 3 orders of magnitude in aggregate numbers as the population has increased by something like a factor of 8. And so we are really good at adapting. And I realize that when I say things like that, people who are singularly focused on mitigation, reducing emissions, get a little squirrely because the climate movement has used human impacts as kind of the advocacy messaging for why we need to act immediately on mitigation. And it turns out that adaptation confounds that line of argument. It doesn't mean that mitigation isn't important. It means that if you're arguing for mitigation based on saving people's lives and reducing risks related to climate, that's not nearly the strongest lever we have to do that. So don't go there. That's my advice, and have better arguments for why mitigation matters.
whether it was well-intentioned policies or not, the idea that you have governments that are controlling air conditioning use with these very restrictive policies, and then you see deaths occurring as a consequence, it seems absurd. Like, that seems like it has to change. Has there been a call to change some of these policies in Europe?
Yeah, this has been an ongoing discussion and debate. But just to give you an example of the sort of thing that was being discussed in Europe last week during the heat wave, at the European Commission, they have a building, the headquarters. I don't know how many floors it is. Maybe in Brussels, I think it's like 11 floors. And during the peak of the heat wave, they put out a memo to all staff in the building that they were going to have to turn the air conditioning off on the first 7 floors. The top 4 floors are where the executives are, and they kept the air conditioning on. And I don't know if there was technical reasons or whatever, but some commentators said, this is the problem with the European Union, is that the executives and the people who run the show get the air conditioning, and the worker bees who are down on the first 7 floors do not. And so a lot of this does come back to visions of democracy and who benefits from technology, who gets to decide. Um, and so, I think our conversations on this topic and on climate change in general are really about the role of expertise, science, technology in places where we think we're making democratic decisions. And the I think a lot of people um, in Europe last week, if they could have had an air conditioner in their house and they could snap their fingers, they would. I saw pictures just this morning of people. Um, I don't know which city in Europe it was. I think it was in France, going to IKEA and hanging out on the couches because it was an air conditioned store. So, uh, events. It's very easy to be opposed to something like air conditioning when it's typical weather in France. It's only when the shit hits the fan where the consequences of our decisions become very apparent.
Could you make an argument that sort of treating adaptation measures as, you know, placing morality on adaptation measures is in and of itself a public health risk or presents a threat to public health?
This is where my science and technology studies background will complicate things. There's no escaping morality. If we want to save human lives, that's a moral choice. And if we want to balance that out with other values we might have, a light footprint on the planet, reducing carbon dioxide emissions, not using energy, um, not buying components for air conditioners from foreign suppliers. Pick your favorite moral outcome. Adaptation is inevitably a value laden moral exercise. And so for me, the most important thing is to put all those values on the table. And I promise you, there are some people who will say, I'm sorry about the old people, but reducing carbon dioxide emissions is more important. And in a democracy, that's a legitimate view, even if some people might recoil at it. Other people might say, I care about my grandma and and I want her to live. And I don't care if it's a coal-fired power plant or, burning wood or whatever it happens to be. I want her to be cool. And that's also a legitimate point of view. And so figuring out how to hash those out in a way that's legitimate and widely respected is our democratic challenge these days.
Now, one thing that is odd here is that there is a big discussion, and I don't know if this is necessarily true, but I've always heard that like the elderly control democracies because their voting tendencies are much higher. Like they tend to vote a lot more. They don't have a lot to do, so they vote. No offense. But the point is, usually elderly people have a lot of political control. And so it would seem that like democracies should favor policies that benefit the elderly. And so why is that not happening in Europe?
No, it's absolutely true. And I mean, just as a perfect example of that, look at debates in France over at what age you retire and get a pension. Europe is a rapidly aging society, and in France, and notably, it's politically poisoned to suggest that benefits in retirement age occur at higher ages, even as people are living longer. Just in the last 2 weeks, that there has been this discussion in France with some politicians on the left characterizing air conditioning as a right wing technology, and if in my opinion, I'm not a handicapper of French politics, but boy, if you want to get some more support for folks on the right, which are doing very well in France at the moment, then associate them with air conditioning during a heat wave, because most people are going to say, well, if air conditioning's right wing, then I guess I am too because I'm hot. So I do think that the politicization of technologies in the context of what real people are experiencing, and in most of Europe, it's an aging population, um, will tend to increase support for people who say we're going to bring the benefits of technology to all the people.
Well, this is another reason why I'm glad to be an American, Roger. I hope that and we're celebrating 250 years, and I'm proud to be American and not in Europe where I wouldn't have air conditioning because that's ridiculous. You're right, though. It's kind of a decision. Do you want old people to be comfortable and live, or do you want to reduce energy usage? I don't know. I guess that just seems a bit odd. It seems odd that like at scale you'd have countries decide that they're willing to sacrifice tens of thousands. I don't mean to laugh, but I find that just odd. It suggests that the society is got their priorities messed up as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, let me say, I used to teach a graduate seminar, and I used the work that Bjorn Lomborg did in his Copenhagen consensus exercise, where he got a bunch of Nobel Prize winning economists and asked them, at the time, it seems ridiculously small now, if you had $50 billion to spend to improve outcomes around the world, how would you spend that money? And choices have to be made in that. And I used to do that in my graduate seminars. I would put the students in groups and I would say, all right, you have 50 billion to spend. How do you want to spend that? And I would use something like childhood medical care in developing countries as the foil. Like for every $1.35 you spend, you can save an infant's life somewhere in the world. And I would say, all right, please justify why your emissions reductions or your corruption reduction or whatever you were interested in, why is that more important than saving the equivalent number of babies around the world? And making those trade-offs explicit and putting the values on the table doesn't guarantee we get the right answer, but I think we have more informed discussions. And so I think Europe would benefit from having a discussion of, all right, what are we exactly doing? What are we trading off when we ban or limit air conditioning? And part of the answer is it has a cost in human lives. And people can, with that information, they can make whatever decision they want to justify. But having that information seems to me to be the first step to a better conversation.
Yeah, I would agree. So has this point been brought up in discussions around this subject in Europe, or is that
It means historically, no, it hasn't had a very large role. I do think it is becoming more important. I do think that the politicization of the issue is kind of forcing this. If air conditioning is right wing, and the folks on the right, Bardella and Le Pen in France, see this as politically advantageous, that conversation is going to happen, and so it probably won't be the most scientific or logical or clean conversation that nerdy professors might have, but it will force it more out into the open.
just the bottom line here is that there's a very clear case of climate policies causing deaths, and they're restricting air conditioning use in Europe. And if you unwound some of those policies, you'd see more people survive, and you might see improvements in education and the economy. And then I guess the one thing that I really think is important about this particular discussion as it relates to like air conditioning use and energy consumption in general is that if the point you made in your preprint is true, and I don't mean like so the
Yeah.
how sound that point is, and if you want to repeat that point again, because I think this is critically important to think about, because it's counterintuitive, like you say, and it sort of unwinds a lot of assumptions people make.
Yeah. I mean, I think, the way I'd put it simply is the absolute amount of energy we consume is not the issue. People like to make that the issue. It's where we get that energy from. So if you're getting that energy from a solar array with battery storage or a nuclear power plant, the consequences are vastly different than if you get it from coal, for example. And so I think, this things, it's counterintuitive, but consuming more energy makes us more efficient in how we use energy. And so think about it this way. People are opposed to AI and data centers. But what if it happens to be the fact that AI advances allow us to be much more efficient in how we optimize the grid for electricity, for example? Um, Opposing the use of these advanced technologies will foreclose opportunities to reap their benefits. And so I'm very much of the view that the trade-off is in rolling back climate policies versus expanding air conditioning. It's expanding air conditioning and adopting better climate policies in parallel. And so the idea, and I know it's consumed the climate movement for a long time, the idea that we advance mitigation through limits or restrictions or bans on technology is never going to work. The world's going to consume massive amounts more energy. Simply because there's 5 billion people who don't enjoy energy services like air conditioning and flights around the world and constant electricity and things like that. So in a world where we're going to have a lot more energy consumption, the challenge is to figure out how to produce that energy, not to restrict it.
I think that's extremely well said, Roger, and that's why I really appreciate your viewpoints on these topics, because it sort of down the middle a little bit. I know that I don't know if you take offense to me saying you're sort of middle of the road or whatever, or like you're the honest broker. You're trying to like give people.
Well, it's not the middle, because the middle
It's not the
isn't
middle.
it's not the
Right.
middle. It's just, I mean, there's recognizing that we have trade-offs should be just kind of normal discussion.
Yeah.
And I know people like to, join teams and tribes, but just calling things like we see them and letting democracy works for me.
To me, that just seems like a very clear case of where we've lost the plot. Like we're not if we're not valuing human lives, if politicians are not valuing their citizens' lives, then they should be like voted out of office, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, if you take a look, I mean, it's the rise of populism and the right in Europe is a thing. It's happening, and so d- I like to say that science and politics are both self-correcting, but in both cases, sometimes it takes a really long time.
Why would air conditioning be a right wing or left wing issue? I mean, policies that reduce air conditioning use. If you have political parties, and they're taking a position on air conditioning, that just seems off to me. Like society as a whole doesn't benefit when a technology like air conditioning, which has a demonstrable effect, like it saves lives, makes it improves everyone's well being and
Right.
quality of life, saves lives. Why making that political, I guess, doesn't, well, I guess it does. Like everything, it gets political. Like my glasses.
Right.
These are right-wing glasses, Roger. I don't know if you knew that these are right-wing. No, it's good. Okay. So any final words on this before I let you go?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to go in and explore these issues. And, I do think it's much larger than just climate change versus air conditioning. I think it's about the questions about how we want to use technologies in our societies that we somehow think are governed by democracies, and everyone gets a voice, given that the consequences of deploying those technologies are uneven. Some people benefit, some people don't. And the perception of benefits may not map onto the real world either. So it's super complicated. And I think the only way we make progress is having conversations.
Right. And try to be thoughtful about it and try to understand like what you're really deciding between and what the consequences, as you say, of the decisions are, and then have the humility to say you're wrong. If you implement a policy that then leads to tremendous harm, have the ability to to say,
Right.
oh, I was wrong, and we're going to change that. And I think that
Right.
that's generally lacking. Whether that can be fixed or not, I don't know. But again, I appreciate your viewpoints on this, Roger, and I look forward to our next conversation. So until next time, this has been Bryce Nichols on Science from the Fringes in defense of climate change. Take care, everybody.